I'm Bud Foote, and this is a course in science fiction. Why would we study science fiction? Outside of the fact that it's fun, I think there are several reasons, but I need to make some distinctions. There's a famous story about Theodore Sturgeon, when he coined a thing which ever since then has been known as Sturgeon's Law. Someone once said to Sturgeon, "Mr. Sturgeon, why do you write science fiction? 90% of science fiction is such crap." And Sturgeon said, "My dear sir, 90% of everything is crap." This, I think, is a rule that holds throughout life. And one of the purposes of education is to be able to discriminate between the 90% and the 10% that's not crap. Secondly, science fiction has labored for a long time under the disadvantage of being somewhat out of its time. Let me explain. Both science fiction and the detective story operate out of an essentially 18th century posture, which is this: no matter how difficult the problem, no matter how baffling the case, human intellect is capable of dealing with it, if not now, later. This is a position that's been really at odds with a great deal of the literature and the thinking of our century. By which I mean the one we just got through. The 20th century was very largely a century of whiners. It's the century of Franz Kafka. It's the century of people walking around, wringing their hands and saying, the human condition is probably not understandable, and if we could understand it, we wouldn't like it. This is obviously at odds with the position of the 17th and 18th centuries, which had a great faith in the ability of human reason, and also at odds with the mindset of engineers in general, who tend to be people who see problems as the meat and drink of what they do. Therefore, science fiction has been just a little bit out of pace with a great deal of the thinking of recent times. Secondly, people say it's popular literature. And the assumption is because it's popular, it can't possibly be any good. This is a piece of outrageous snobbery. One of the most popular artists of our day, who, as I speak, I saw a couple of nights ago, is Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson at Chastain Park 2 nights ago had 30,000 people going absolutely bananas. He is on tour constantly. He is an extraordinarily popular artist. And everybody who has listened critically and carefully to Willie Nelson knows perfectly well that he is an extraordinary guitarist and a song stylist absolutely unlike anybody else who's ever come down the road. People forget that William Shakespeare was a popular artist in his own day. He made a ton of money. He retired early. He thought, poor man, that his name in literature would be made not by the plays that he wrote, but by the poetry that he wrote, particularly the longer poems, which nobody reads except English majors. It's very difficult to tell what of popular art today will survive and be thought great in the future, but you can't write off something simply because, like science fiction, it's popular. Why read science fiction? Why study it? Why think about it? Robert Heinlein said that science fiction was perhaps the most realistic fiction being written today, and went on to explain that the overwhelming fact of our time, and for the past couple of centuries, has been change. We have to deal with enormous amounts of change. My father was born the year the Wright brothers flew their first airplane. He lived to see people walk on the moon. This is an extraordinary thing if you think about it. Now, the pace of change since the Industrial Revolution has been ever accelerating. I don't care how you quantify it, number of inventions, gross national product, population density, change has been increasing exponentially since the Industrial Revolution, and it shows no signs of slowing down. We live in a very dynamic world. It is absolutely certain that you will not die in anything like the world you were born into, unless, God forbid, something takes you off before your time. We could illustrate this in a number of ways. In 1954, I wrote and sold a story to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which featured a computer. Now, you must understand that at that time, leading thinkers about computers were saying things like this: there will never be a computer that can play chess, because to devise a computer that would play chess, it would have to occupy the whole Empire State Building, and it would require Niagara Falls to cool it. Clearly, you have more muscle on your desktop than existed in the world at that time. My computer, which ran the whole American economy in my story, occupied the whole eastern seaboard. And I was being very audacious and pushing the envelope. I read that story now, not only am I humbled by what a bad writer I was at that time, but I'm humbled by the fact that my vision was so short. And this has been an experience of science fiction writer after science fiction writer. So, we have to deal with the fact of change. Your teachers have told you again and again and again, until you're tired of it, that if you're going to function in the world that faces you, you must prepare yourselves to be lifelong students. This is a fact, for good or for bad, because we are not in the Middle Ages. There was a time when you could learn your trade by the time you were 15, and when you died of old age at 45, your trade would not have changed that much. You could pretty well learn as a kid, and it would take you through life. There are very, very few fields today in which this is the case. The second point that has to be made is that every major technological change brings about changes in human values, changes in our attitudes, changes in what we think of ourselves and each other, and changes in the social fabric. When my father graduated from college, he and a college chum took a trip to Chicago, to the Chicago World's Fair. I can remember, this was before I was born, okay? I can remember as a child, when these two people would get together, they would talk about that trip as if it were a major odyssey. Today, I go to Chicago, I come home, it's not much of a trip, it doesn't take that long. It's really very modest journey. Our attitudes toward time and space have changed. Our perceptions of time and space have changed. And if you think that the rate of change has stopped, I think you're very, very wrong. So science fiction deals with change. Now, change. Attitudes towards change vary enormously from time to time and from individual to individual. I found it useful in thinking about my own attitudes and attitudes of other people to recognize that everybody has a need for certain stability and predictability in his or her life. We also, because we are thinking creatures with a monstrous forebrain, have a need for new experiences, for novelty, for surprise. The arts play on this. There is a kind of art that begins in the familiar and looks at it very, very hard, and all of a sudden you say, but that's very strange. There's another kind that begins with the strange, and then you look at it for a while and you say, but somehow I knew that all the time. This movement from the strange to the familiar, from the familiar to the strange. When you're a small child, you need a great deal of predictability. Some of you perhaps have children, and if you have, you know that a child who is accustomed to eating at 6 o'clock, at 6:05, his stomach thinks his throat is cut. You cannot read a book twice to a child and change anything. He wants it to be the way it was. Children have a high need for predictability and a very low need for novelty. Get into the teen years, you have a higher and higher need for novelty. Your parents are predictable, boring. This varies from individual to individual, but always we need both. Now, in a traditional society, change is almost always threatening. And there's a part of us that's traditional. If you go to, let's say, a medieval farmer and say, you're operating on the two-field principle. You're cultivating a field and then you're letting it lie fallow in the next year so you can go cultivate the field which this year is lying fallow. This is a way you keep your farm going. If you go and say, people have discovered that we can use a three-field principle and cultivate two of the fields one year and let only one field lie fallow, we'll gain a certain amount of agricultural production that way. The reaction of the elders of the tribe is going to be, and not stupidly, hey, we know that what we're doing works. You've come along with something that we don't know that it works by experience, and if it doesn't work, we're all dead. Better to hold with the evils that we have than fly to others that we know not of. This is a very sensible and conservative position to take. On the other hand, you hold to that all the time and we'd still be using a two-farm principle and be operating on a medieval level. So some change, which change? These are the decisions that we make all the time. And we make them essentially on a non-technical basis. We have reached a place now where if we're willing to put the time and the money into it, we can do almost anything we can think of. We can, if we're willing to spend the money, spend the exertion, within 50 years we probably could extend the human lifespan by decades. Do we decide to do it? Will the Social Security system collapse if we do it? Is it a worthwhile thing to do? Do we want to turn all of the warmer part of this country into a giant geriatric ward? These are decisions that are not engineering decisions. They're moral decisions, they're humanistic decisions, they are decisions which have to be made once you raise the technological issues. But we can do all manner of things. The question of we can't do them all. Which of them do we do? And which of them bring us curses that we didn't anticipate? This is one of the things, quite obviously, that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is about. It's very interesting that when Frankenstein is making the monster, he tries to make it very beautiful. As soon as the monster comes alive, he perceives it as ugly and flees. Look at the reaction of a great many people who worked on the atomic bomb. It was a very interesting technological problem. They solved it. They vaporized, or caused to have vaporized, a couple of Japanese cities. And all of a sudden, a great many of them said, "My God, what have we done?" Change can be very threatening, but change is also a great possible blessing. This is one of the things that this literature is about. Okay, you've read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we've talked about it, and we've chatted about it in chat room. A great many people, as we've said before, regard this as the first really significant novel in the field of science fiction. If you think back to what we said about problems of definition, you will, of course, realize that this is not unanimous. But we can take that, along with a number of thinkers in the field, Brian Aldiss very notably, as a kind of starting point for modern science fiction. One of the reasons that it's difficult to tell when science fiction begins is that a great many aspects of science fiction appear in earlier literature. One of the reasons we don't call a lot of that stuff science fiction is that, first, nobody had a really clear notion of what we would call science. The division between science and philosophy was very foggy indeed. And very often the division between science and theology was foggy. And second, there wasn't a clear division between history and fiction for a great many people. So if you don't have a good definition of science, and you don't have a good definition of fiction, it's highly unlikely that you're going to come out with anything you can solidly call science fiction. So what I'd like to do for the next week is look at some of the ancestors of science fiction and look at some of the themes that are going to be picked up again in science fiction. Some of these are mythological. The wonderful machine. There is a myth which says that in ancient times a bronze man was created that stalked around the island of Crete and protected it from its enemies. That's mythological. It also sounds very suspiciously like a robot. The extraordinary voyage, which goes back at least to the Odyssey. Questions about what it is to be human, a theme that we've seen working in Frankenstein. Is Frankenstein human? Yes, he is. He thinks like a human being. He talks like a human being. He has a heart like a human being. And like any child, if you mistreat him, he's going to be irritated and behave badly. What is it to be a human being? The word orangutan in Malay means man who lives in the woods. Is there a division between our great ape cousins and us? Well, we have immortal souls. No doubt, but, prove to me that I have it and that the orang does not. There are groups of people all around the northern part of the world who think the bears are people. In a lot of ways, they're like us, bad-tempered, tend to walk on two legs and be menacing. Maybe they are our cousins. Maybe they are people. Questions of the alien and whether we treat the alien as a people or not. You know, all of these things have been around for a long, long time. We've had the question of the utopia. Almost anybody who's thought about the political economic situation that he lived in has said at some time or another, there ought to be a better way to do this. In the Renaissance, St. Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia, which is Greek for no place, or good place, depending on how you spell it. There were utopias before, all the way back, at least, to Plato's Republic. Are these science fiction? Well, almost, and not quite. How about today's utopias? Are they science fiction? Well, we generally count them as such. So we want to talk about what Brian Aldiss calls, and I think it's a good name, so we've decided to steal it, the honorable ancestors, those forebears of science fiction that take us back to the very beginnings of our literature. We don't claim these as science fiction for reasons I've just mentioned, but they are clearly kinfolk from the past. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is, beyond dispute, the greatest novel ever written by a teenager. When I told this to one class, one young man, very nonplussed, said, "You mean she was really only 18 years old when she wrote this book?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "God damn, she would have been a heavy date," which apparently was, in fact, the case, as you find out from her history. There are three very important mythic figures in our culture, it seems to me, two of which came out of the 19th century and one of which came out of the 20th century. These are figures of popular culture that became exceedingly well known and have very, very important symbolic value. Let me deal with the 20th century one first. That's Tarzan. All kinds of people who've never heard of Edgar Rice Burroughs know something about Tarzan. Tarzan is the archetypal rejecter of civilization. This is a very Rousseau-esque, romantic figure who, brought up in the jungle, prefers the jungle. He is, it turns out, of course, in true melodramatic fashion, an English lord. He tries that, he doesn't like it worth a damn, he goes back to the jungle. This appeals to the part of us, I suppose, that is stifled or somehow cramped by our own societies, our own civilizations. The two 19th century ones are Santa Claus on the one hand and the Frankenstein monster on the other. Santa Claus, it seems to me, is that part of our culture, increasingly mechanized, increasingly productive, that brings you, if you are a virtuous person, goodies, toys, pleasant things. The Frankenstein monster is that darker side of Santa Claus that brings us all kinds of things, again as a result of our increasingly mechanized, increasingly productive culture, that are a bit nightmarish. And it's not surprising that the Frankenstein monster has meant many, many different things to many people. It's also not surprising that somehow the movie has impinged on our vision of the novel. A couple of things you should avoid. You should avoid, for example, calling Victor Frankenstein Dr. Frankenstein. He is in the movie. He's not in the novel. You should avoid the movie cliche, Dr. Frankenstein, there are some things man was not meant to know. That doesn't appear anywhere in the novel. And obviously, the monster has no name. His name is not Frankenstein, and this is one of his problems, because among other things, as it's been pointed out, the novel Frankenstein is a great novel about child abuse. The monster wants simply for his creator to love him. and be good to him. And Victor is not. Victor rejects him. It's interesting, of course, to point out that Mary Shelley was a young woman who had lost her mother very shortly after her own birth, and whose father, William Godwin, an extraordinary man in many, many ways, was in many ways an emotionless stick of a man. When Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, in her own right an extraordinary woman, was dying, she said to her husband in a moment of remission of pain, "Oh, William, I'm in heaven." He said, "You mean, my dear, that the agony is somewhat abated?" The sort of thing that betrays someone who's not exactly the most affectionate and loving father. So to some extent, I suspect Mary was working out a few of her own problems, as well as the problems of her society in this novel. Jules Verne, whom a lot of Americans call Jules Verne, was born in his family on the coast of France, in the town of Nantes. It is said that, like a lot of kids who grow up in the seashore, he always wanted to go to sea. He always wanted to be a sailor. The story is, and this is hard to verify or to disprove, that when he was 12 or 13 years old, he stowed away on a ship, hoping to be accepted as part of the crew, got out of the harbor, and was only brought back by his father after his father got a hold of a fast ship and chased the other ship down the coast and got him back home. He went off to Paris to study, got infatuated with the theater, tried the theater for a bit, and ultimately began writing fiction. His collected works go under the super title of Voyages Extraordinaires, Extraordinary Voyages. Some of these extraordinary voyages are what we would call science fiction. Others we would call mainstream. There's no particular technological advance, no particular science fiction-y element. All of them involve voyage. The man voyaged incredibly in his mind, in time and in space, and took his readers with them. There are problems that we'll talk about later on, which arise at least partly from the really almost incredible story. It's one of those things that happens in novels, but not real life. Nearly 100 years after his death, a lost novel by Verne surfaced. So a new Jules Verne novel appeared on the scene. The thing which made it interesting was that it would have been his second, or perhaps his third, depending on how you count serializations. It would have been his second or perhaps his third novel. And it was fairly grim. It was called Paris in the Year 2000. It's interesting to see his vision of Paris in the year 2000, now that that year has passed. To a lot of things, readers have said, he got that right. The thing that's interesting is it's a very grim book, and it's a very early book. The received wisdom about Jules Verne was at that point turned on its head, because the feeling always was that he had been bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, technocratic, optimistic, a lover of technology early on, that as he grew older he took a number of lumps, as most people do. He had a bad time with his son. He got shot in the foot by his goofy nephew. His mistress died. any one of these could spoil your whole day. And the received wisdom was that his books got grimmer and grimmer as he got older and older. Excuse me. But here you have a book, very early production, which is among his grimmest. All of a sudden, we begin to look at the earlier books with a much more careful eye. And we begin to wonder, are the books quite as optimistic as we thought they were? And second, how much of that is due to his editor, who was a great deal of help to him, but also may have gotten in the way of what was a more complicated writer than appeared in a great many of the early books. Two things we find in Verne. First, obviously, the extraordinary voyage. Okay, write that down. It's one of the major themes in pre-science fiction and in science fiction. And second, the extraordinary machine. Verne always used technology that was not too far in advance of the technology of his own day. The wonderful submarine of Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And in The Trip to the Moon, a projectile which is fired out of an enormous cannon located not too far from Cape Canaveral. It wouldn't have worked. I mean, you all will read this and say, yeah, right. The cannon would go off and everybody inside the hollow shell would be distributed in a film 1 molecule thick against the back end of the shell. But still, it was a great imagining, a wonderful machine that, again, is one of the themes that runs through everything we're going to look at. So remember the extraordinary voyage, remember the wonderful machine. There are a couple of Darwins that you have to keep straight here. Erasmus Darwin was Charles's grandfather. In many ways, a most extraordinary fellow. A physician, a member of a club of amateur scientists, a person who spent a good deal of his time turning good science into pretty bad poetry. But an amateur of the field and a very creative guy. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's preface, she remarks about an experiment of Dr. Darwin's. That's not Charles. That's his grandfather, Erasmus. Now, Charles Darwin's thoughts and the thoughts of people around him made an impact on the Victorian age that has not ceased to the present day. There are still a great many people who hold with the doctrine of special creation. The notions of Darwin complicated our visions of what it was to be human in a way that nothing perhaps before had ever done. If you asked, let's say, a 12th century priest what a human being was and what a human being was supposed to do, the answer was obvious. A human being is created in the image of God, by God. To the extent that he's imperfect, it's a result of the sin of our foreparents. And his duty, it's in the catechism. It's to serve and glorify God and love him forever and ever. That's it. That's what you have to do. If, on the other hand, we are descended from lower animals, brother to dragon and kinship to owls, then our vision of ourselves changes a good deal. Now, H.G. Wells, an extraordinary man and an extraordinary writer, who again wrote fiction, nonfiction, important essays, history, and science fiction and mainstream stuff. A very, very important man and one of the most influential writers of the early part of this century was a convinced Darwinian. He'd gone to school to Huxley, who had had the big debate about evolution with Soapy Sam Wilberforce. He accepted, if you will, Darwinism, but he saw all the difficulties of it. Now, one of the difficulties, very simply, is if we are a product of evolution, what is left over from our kinship with our pre-human parents? This perhaps was done most efficiently not by Wells, but by another writer of essentially the same period, Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you will remember the bestial side of Dr. Jekyll's nature is revealed by a potion. We are perhaps all a bit gorilla-like, is the reflection here. The other question is, are we finished? What is evolution likely to do with us in the next 1 million, 2 million, 10 million years? In The Time Machine, we have, as we have so often in science fiction, a speculation about the future and a vision of the present. If things go on, Wells is saying, as they're now going on, we might expect to find human beings splitting into two species. One pleasant, amiable, charming, beautiful, and stupid. The other efficient, intelligent, cruel, beaten down, and bestial. The aristocracy and the po-folk become two species of humans who don't even recognize that they're related. This is, as you see, not only a speculation about what might happen because of Darwinian principles, but it's also a kind of a satire on what was going on during Wells's own time, as he does so often. You'll remember that we talked before about utopias. It's a pun from the Greek. It either means no place or good place. And speculation about ideal societies has usually been called utopian after the book by St. Thomas More. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as you already know and have seen, the threatening aspects of modern society became more and more evident to a great many people. And so we get a species of writing which has been termed dystopia, which is the opposite, if you will, of a utopia. Now, dystopias come in several fashions. One, there's the dystopia that is set up to be a utopia and works, but does things to human beings that are ugly. The best example of this, perhaps, is Aldous Huxley's 1930s book, Brave New World. It was set up to be an ideal society, and for a lot of people in it, it is. There's a lot of good dope. Everybody has a job. Everybody consumes at a high level. But the reaction that most readers have to this is, what a bummer. I mean, there's no fun in that. There's nothing worth doing. It's not a utopia. It's a dystopia. Sometimes there's a dystopia that isn't set up as a utopia, and the most famous one there is probably George Orwell's 1984. It is set up so that a small group of people can control and have power over a great mass of people, not only telling them what to do, but how to think. Then there's, of course, the utopia, which comes simply because people screw up. And this is the dystopic novel, very often of total war and its aftermath, or ecological collapse. And we have a number of that sort of dystopias that are cited in one of the handouts that I gave you. An important dystopia is We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Zamyatin was a Bolshevik. Zamyatin took part in the 1906 uprising, was exiled. Zamyatin eventually got through the Polytechnic in St. Petersburg, spent the first Russian Revolution outside of the country because he'd been sent by the Tsar to England to manufacture icebreakers. He was an engineer. After the Russian Revolution, there was an extraordinary blossoming of the arts in Russia. And it was at this point, about 1920, that Zamyatin wrote We. But already, by the time he wrote it, a certain ossification had begun to set in. And you can see why this would happen. Science fiction speculates about various futures. Marxism is pretty sure what the future is, or at least classical Marxism. So therefore, if you speculate about the future in a way that doesn't agree with what the party believes, you're subject to get into trouble. And of course, this is what happened. Zamyatin couldn't get it published in Russia. He became a bad guy. He found it difficult to get anything published. The book was published in little bits and pieces outside of Russia, sometimes in one really funny one. It was published in a bad translation. It was then published in Russian outside of the country, but in Russian it's been was all mixed up, so that the people who published it could represent that it was a retranslation from the Czech translation, and Zamyatin wouldn't get in trouble. This was not the case. They had Zamyatin's original, he just messed it up so it would look like a translation. Ironically enough, the first publication of We in English took place, the first publication of We in Russian, complete, the way Zamyatin wrote it, took place in New York City in 1952. Now, of course, it's become available in Russia, and people are discovering him. He was a man of extraordinary skill. In many, many ways, he's ahead of his time. One of the things that we've been talking about, and we'll talk about some more, is expository technique. And Zamyatin's book begins in the future with no preparation for the reader. And this is maybe the first important science fiction book to do just that. I started teaching this course in 1972. And every time I've taught it, my students have come up with two objections. They're sure to pick out at least one book that I assign and say, this is a good enough book, but it's not really science fiction. And I say, I thought it was my idea. And then there's another one, they say, how can you dare to teach a science fiction course and leave out? And then any one of a number of names will pop up. I don't want you to walk away thinking that the 8 books that I've assigned and the 2 books that you've read outside are the only ones that there are there. or even the only ones that are important. We could junk this whole course and make up a course with other writers and still have a very good course and cover the ground very, very well. So I want quickly, for the next couple of sessions, to deal with a great many writers that I think we need to mention, I think you need to know about. I think if you're not acquainted with them, they are people whose names should be familiar to you. This does not by any means bring us up to date. It's very difficult today to stay abreast of all the science fiction writers that surface. But these are some that I know about that I'd recommend to you that are important for various reasons, which I'll try to cover.